People say, move fast and break things is the ultimate motto for tech startups. But when you apply that mindset to a telehealth platform, the thing you break is not source code. It is federal law. I was the only barrier between the company and the Drug Enforcement Administration until Human Resources decided my diligence slowed down growth. So I smiled, packed my desk, and silently counted down until the $250,000 fine arrived. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without an operating budget to keep bringing you these narratives. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, longer, and more detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube. You can join us by scanning the QR code right on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the comments section. Now, let us dive into today's corporate nightmare. My name is Paisley Diaz. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I worked as a medical license verification specialist at VitaStream Health. VitaStream was one of those flashy telehealth platforms that burned through venture capital money like it was cheap firewood in a desperate bid to dominate the market share. The office environment was a chaotic, toxic blend of forced fun and reckless ambition. We had kombucha on tap, indoor putting greens, and a chief executive officer who wore excessively expensive sneakers while throwing around buzzwords like disruption and democratizing medicine. But my corner of the office was entirely different. I did not care about ping-pong tournaments or aggressive marketing strategies. I was quiet, methodical, and completely uncompromising. My core responsibility was not glamorous, but it was the literal shield keeping the executive board out of federal prison. I spent my days meticulously cross-referencing identities and validating credentials. Before any physician was allowed to log onto our platform, consult with a patient, and prescribe medication, I had to ensure they possessed a valid medical license for their specific state and a legitimate Drug Enforcement Administration registration number. If a doctor wanted to prescribe controlled substances over the internet, they had to pass through my rigorous vetting process first. There were no exceptions, no shortcuts, and no compromises. No matter how desperately the growth team wanted to launch our services in a new territory, I was the invisible wall standing between a legitimate medical service and a digital pill mill. That fragile, carefully maintained order was violently ripped apart the day they brought in Chloe. She was newly appointed as our Vice President of Talent and Velocity. Yes, Talent and Velocity was her actual, printed job title. Chloe blew into the office carrying a cheap Silicon Valley mindset, armed with a degree in something incredibly vague and an absolute terrifying obsession with internal headcount growth charts. To her, a doctor was not a highly trained medical professional responsible for human lives. A doctor was merely a metric, a tiny data point on a graph that needed to go up and to the right at any cost to impress our investors. It did not take long for her to target my department. During a massive all-hands meeting on a Tuesday morning, Chloe decided to publicly humiliate my vetting process to establish her dominance. She projected a massive slide showing my standard 7-day background check timeline. Painting it bright red, she loudly criticized my methods in front of the entire company. Pacing across the room with a microphone, she called my procedures outdated, extremely cumbersome, and a massive bottleneck to the company vision. According to Chloe, my insistence on independently verifying federal credentials was actively hindering VitaStream from recruiting doctors who had massive social media followings. She wanted these so-called influencer doctors to join our app instantly, start seeing patients within hours, and generate revenue without waiting a full week for me to contact state medical boards and verify their disciplinary histories. After the meeting concluded, I pulled her aside into one of our soundproof, glass-walled conference rooms. I stayed perfectly calm, refusing to let her theatrical presentation rattle me. I laid out the strict federal medical regulations on the table, explaining exactly why the Drug Enforcement Administration requires rigorous compliance for remote prescriptions. I detailed the severe legal liabilities and the potential harm to patients if we allowed unverified or previously suspended practitioners to hand out narcotics online. I thought presenting the sheer legal danger would sober her up. I was entirely wrong. Chloe did not even pretend to listen to my warnings. She looked at me, completely unbothered, and waved her hand in the air as if she was swatting away a bothersome insect. She offered a condescending smirk, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered a sentence that made my blood run cold. "We are selling convenience. Paisley, stop acting like you work for the government." That exact moment was a chilling revelation. Chloe's arrival was not just a frustrating shift in corporate culture. It was an absolute omen of a catastrophic systemic disaster. Working in compliance gives you a highly sensitive radar for impending legal liabilities. And my radar was screaming. She was blatantly willing to trade patient safety for rapid expansion. I could feel the crosshairs shifting directly onto my back. I knew a ruthless corporate purge was coming, and I knew she would try to push me out for refusing to bend the law to fit her metrics. But as I walked back to my desk, looking at the neatly organized files of verified medical professionals, my mind was perfectly clear. I made a silent, ironclad vow. I was not going to let myself become the sacrificial lamb when this house of cards inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. I would let them move fast, but I would make sure I was nowhere near the blast radius when they finally broke the law. The disaster did not creep in quietly. It slammed into the platform with the force of a hurricane, disguised as a software update. On a random Thursday morning, an automated company-wide email announced the immediate deployment of a brand new feature called Auto Approve. The concept was as reckless as it sounded. Instead of my standard, rigorous vetting, new medical providers would be granted full access to our patient network within 24 hours of clicking submit. The only requirements to pass this automated gateway were a self-declared resume typed into a web form and a few uploaded images of their credentials. Most of these uploads were blurry, poorly cropped photos taken in bad lighting, completely unverified by any primary source. The consequences were instantaneous and terrifying. By noon that same day, the back-end system was overflowing with applications that should have triggered immediate lockdown protocols. I watched in absolute horror as a massive wave of severely deficient profiles flooded past the automated checkpoints. There were applicants whose files completely lacked basic criminal background checks. I found profiles with medical licenses that had expired months, or even years, prior. Worst of all, the system was blindly accepting Drug Enforcement Administration registration numbers that did not even match the states where these supposed doctors were applying to practice. A practitioner registered in New York was suddenly approved to prescribe heavy sedatives to patients in California, a blatant violation of federal jurisdiction. The safety net was completely gone. I refused to let it happen on my watch. When the rest of the office emptied out for happy hour, I stayed glued to my monitors. The neon lights of the city outside my window flickered on as I dug into the digital trenches. I worked deep into the night, manually reviewing the flood of automated approvals. My eyes burned from the screen glare as I painstakingly cross-referenced the newly activated accounts against federal databases. I attached glaring red flags to every single violating profile. I typed out detailed justifications for each violation, citing the exact federal codes they breached. Then, I initiated strict internal suspension protocols, temporarily revoking their platform access until a proper manual verification could be completed. I left the office well past midnight, exhausted but relieved, believing I had contained the immediate threat to patient safety. That fragile relief shattered the moment I logged into my terminal the following morning. I opened the compliance dashboard expecting to see a long list of suspended accounts waiting for manual review. Instead, the screen was a sea of bright green checkmarks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I frantically clicked through the activity logs. Every single red flag I had painstakingly applied the night before was gone. Every suspension had been manually lifted. The audit trail revealed exactly what had happened. Sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, Chloe had logged in using her newly acquired top-tier executive administrative rights. She had completely bypassed the compliance department, overridden my safety holds, and forced the system to activate those questionable accounts. As I sat there staring at the screen, those exact same unverified doctors were already logging online, accepting virtual appointments, and writing live prescriptions for real human beings. I knew I had to address it immediately, but I needed to be strategic. I waited for the weekly departmental briefing. The room was packed with engineers, marketing staff, and executives. When it was my turn to speak, I carefully brought up the overnight overrides. I framed it as a potential software glitch, asking why accounts with critical credential mismatches were currently active on the live server. The room fell completely silent. Chloe did not even flinch. She leaned back in her expensive ergonomic chair, crossed her arms, and offered a terrifyingly condescending smile that swept across the room. She looked at me with pure disdain. "Stop nitpicking. If there are minor errors, we will pay the fine. It is just the cost of doing business." The sheer audacity of her statement echoed in my ears. A mismatched federal drug registration was not a minor error. It was a massive federal offense. But in that chilling moment, looking at the nodding heads of the other executives who were mesmerized by her confidence, a profound realization washed over me. This company was fully prepared to gamble with the actual lives of unsuspecting patients just to inflate their monthly activation metrics. There was no reasoning with a leadership team that viewed federal penalties as a simple line item on a budget spreadsheet. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded, closed my laptop, and let the meeting proceed. The time for professional debate was over. The moment I returned to my desk, my entire demeanor shifted from compliance officer to survivalist. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a personal, military-grade encrypted hard drive. I plugged it into a hidden port on my docking station, working methodically and silently. I began running background scripts to copy every single system operation. I exported the original application files, the blurry photos, my suspension logs, and most importantly, the exact timestamps of Chloe using her administrative privileges to override my safety blocks. I was no longer trying to save the company. I was meticulously building an airtight vault of evidence, preparing for the inevitable moment the authorities came kicking down our doors. The psychological warfare began with an eerie, suffocating silence. In the corporate world, they do not usually fire you right away when you become a problem. Instead, they make you a ghost. Over the next 14 days, my inbox, which used to be flooded with hundreds of messages a shift, slowly dried up. Chloe had initiated a systematic campaign of isolation. I found myself inexplicably removed from critical departmental email chains. Calendar invites for security briefings vanished from my schedule. When I tried to log into the secondary verification databases, I was greeted with cold error messages stating my access tier had been downgraded. The most public blow came during the first quarter all-hands presentation. While pacing the stage, Chloe made a very deliberate, sweeping gesture toward my corner of the room and told the entire company that they could no longer afford to let stubborn roadblocks stand in the way of exponential growth. She never said my name, but the collective, uncomfortable shifting of over 100 chairs told me everyone knew exactly who she meant. I was being boxed into a corner, meant to feel so useless and alienated that I would just quietly resign. But then a profile for Dr. Vance appeared in the system, and the petty office politics escalated into a legitimate nightmare. It was late on a Wednesday afternoon when I noticed his file pinging through the new automated gateway. His application had been rubber-stamped with lightning speed, granting him full prescribing privileges almost instantly. Something about his incredibly sparse resume bothered me deeply. Since my primary tools were restricted, I had to dig through public state registry archives manually. It took me 3 grueling hours of cross-referencing obscure medical board minutes from 3 states away, but I finally found the buried truth. Dr. Vance was not just an underqualified applicant. He was a massive liability waiting to explode. 2 years prior, his medical license had been permanently revoked in a neighboring jurisdiction. The official state board documents detailed a horrifying pattern of abusing his prescribing power, specifically handing out massive quantities of highly addictive painkillers to patients without any physical examinations. He was essentially a digital drug dealer wearing a white coat, and Chloe had just handed him the keys to our entire national patient network. Adrenaline flooded my system. This was no longer about missed paperwork. This was a direct, immediate threat to human life. I bypassed my restricted dashboard, diving into the back-end administrative console using a legacy developer code they had forgotten to revoke. Within 60 seconds, I executed a hard lock on the account of Dr. Vance, completely freezing his ability to contact patients or access the digital pharmacy portal. Immediately after, I drafted an emergency, high-priority email. I attached every single piece of damning evidence I had unearthed: the state board revocation documents, the disciplinary hearing transcripts, and the detailed records of his previous narcotics violations. I sent this comprehensive package directly to the head of human resources and the chief legal officer, making sure to copy Chloe on the thread so she knew exactly what I had done. The reaction was explosive. Barely 10 minutes had passed before my office door flew open with such force that it slammed violently against the wall. Chloe stormed in, her face flushed with absolute fury. She marched directly up to my workspace and slammed both of her hands flat onto my desk, rattling my monitors. She leaned over me, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss that echoed in the small space. "Who gave you the authority to lock an active provider account?" she demanded, completely ignoring the massive legal liability I had just prevented. "I am doing my job, Chloe," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Did you read the attachments? The man lost his license for operating a pill mill. It is a massive federal violation to let him on our platform." She did not care about the facts. She pointed a trembling finger right in my face. "You do not have the clearance to make those decisions anymore. I am officially stripping you of all account moderation privileges right now. From this second forward, your role is strictly to advise. You will absolutely not interfere in the recruitment process ever again. Do you understand me?" She stood there, breathing heavily, expecting a fight. She wanted me to raise my voice. She wanted me to threaten to sue the company, or break down crying, or storm out of the building in a righteous rage so she could immediately terminate me for insubordination. Instead, I did the one thing she never anticipated. I looked up at her angry face, let out a soft breath, and smiled gently. It was a calm, compliant, utterly defeated smile. "I understand completely, Chloe," I said softly, nodding my head in total submission. "I will not interfere anymore." The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by her overwhelming sense of triumph. Chloe stood up straight, smoothing down her designer jacket. She offered me a smug, victorious smirk, genuinely believing she had finally crushed the will of the stubborn compliance officer. She turned on her heel and marched out of my office, convinced she had won the war. She had no idea that her perceived victory was the final nail in her own coffin. I was not surrendering. I was simply getting out of the way of the train wreck. By explicitly ordering me not to interfere and officially removing my ability to stop the illegal activity, she had just assumed 100% of the legal liability. That very night, from the safety of my own living room, I booted up my personal computer. I did not just take a few casual screenshots. I compiled a massive, encrypted digital dossier. I packaged the state board records for Dr. Vance, the server logs proving his auto-approval, a copy of the emergency email I had sent to the legal team, and the time-stamped system alerts showing Chloe revoking my permissions immediately afterward. I bundled this explosive package and transmitted it directly to a high-powered private attorney I had retained days earlier. By putting the evidence in the hands of an external legal counsel, I established an undeniable, federally recognized timeline. The trap was fully set. The evidence was secured off-site, and my hands were officially clean. Now, all I had to do was watch them burn. I did not waste another single second arguing with a brick wall. While the executive suite continued to pop champagne over their artificially inflated user metrics, I channeled every ounce of my frustration into a flawless exit strategy. I knew fighting them internally was a losing battle, so I took the war outside their walls. During my designated lunch breaks, I would sit in the suffocating heat of my parked car, running the air conditioning on low, and take highly confidential phone interviews. I set my sights entirely on a massive, highly prestigious national hospital network. Unlike the chaotic startup I was currently trapped in, this was a legacy institution that treated federal regulatory compliance like the literal lifeblood of their entire organization. They did not view legal boundaries as annoying roadblocks to be smashed. They viewed them as the absolute foundation of patient safety. They immediately respected my meticulous nature and recognized the value of my strict adherence to protocol. Within 7 short days of my first interview, I received a formal, heavily watermarked offer letter. The position they offered was Director of Compliance. The starting salary was exactly double what I was currently making, accompanied by a comprehensive benefits package that made my startup perks look like an absolute joke. I signed the digital contract the very same day, but I locked down my digital footprint like a maximum security vault. I absolutely did not update my professional networking profiles, and I breathed not a single syllable of my massive career leap to anyone in the office. As far as my current coworkers knew, I was just a defeated, exhausted employee quietly fading away into the background. I drafted my official letter of resignation with the surgical precision of a seasoned lawyer. I provided the standard 2 weeks of notice, ensuring no one could possibly accuse me of a sudden or disruptive departure that breached my contract. When the human resources representative pulled me into a sterile meeting room and asked for my reasons, I kept my tone remarkably soft and my words entirely void of any malice. I told them I simply wanted to take some time to rest, step away from the fast-paced tech world, and find an environment that better suited my personal career orientation. I played the part of the burned-out, completely overwhelmed worker to absolute perfection. My exceptionally professional and harmless attitude gave them zero ammunition to withhold my final paycheck or march me out of the building prematurely with security guards. I desperately needed those final 14 days to quietly set the board for my endgame. On my second-to-last afternoon, Chloe insisted on throwing a farewell gathering in the communal employee break room. It was a sickening masterpiece of corporate theater. She had purchased a remarkably cheap sheet cake from a discount grocery store, the kind covered in aggressively bright, neon frosting that tasted like pure sugar and industrial chemicals. Chloe stood at the head of the room, beaming with genuine, uncontainable joy. She handed me a flimsy plastic plate with a massive slice of cake, her eyes gleaming with the unmistakable satisfaction of a predator that had successfully driven a rival out of her territory. She actually pulled me in for a hug, a stiff, incredibly awkward physical gesture, and loudly wished me the absolute best of luck in all my future endeavors. She was visibly thrilled to the core to finally rid herself of the annoying thorn in her side. I smiled back warmly, thanked her for the unique opportunity to learn from her leadership, and quietly ate my cheap slice of cake. I was more than happy to let her bask in her fleeting moment of false victory. My final Friday at the company arrived quietly. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the massive open floor plan office was mostly empty as people rushed out to start their weekend drinking early. I stayed behind, standing alone in my small workspace to clean out my desk. But I was doing much more than packing up my personal coffee mug and a few small potted plants. I executed my final, most carefully calculated maneuver. I accessed my archived digital folders and sent a command to the heavy-duty printer down the hall. I printed out hard copies of every single legal warning email I had ever sent to the Human Resources Department and the executive team. I printed out the precise, highlighted pages of the federal regulations detailing the severe criminal penalties for prescribing narcotics without verification. I took these highly explosive, incredibly damning documents and clipped them perfectly straight. I tucked them neatly right into the front pocket of the master physical compliance binders that company policy required me to leave behind for my successor. I placed the binders squarely in the dead center of my freshly wiped desk. Impossible to miss. It was an undeniable, physical paper trail left completely out in the open. It was not a careless mistake. It was a meticulously constructed, perfectly baited mousetrap, sitting silently in the dark office, just waiting for the inevitable moment the federal investigators came searching for hard evidence of corporate negligence. I grabbed my small cardboard box, turned off the overhead lights in my workspace, and walked down the long, carpeted hallway for the very last time. I handed my physical security badge and my company-issued laptop to the front desk receptionist without a single backward glance. When I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the flashy corporate headquarters and stepped out into the crisp evening air, I did not feel a single trace of sadness, anger, or regret. I took a long, deep breath, feeling a profound, heavy sense of relief wash over my entire body. I was not giving up. I was not running away from a fight I was too weak to finish. I was simply making the tactical, empowering decision to step off a doomed ocean liner. I had seen the massive iceberg approaching from miles away. I had sounded the alarms, and the leadership had ordered the engines to speed up. Now, I was sitting safely in a distant lifeboat, watching the glittering ship sail full speed into the pitch-black night, knowing with absolute certainty that it was only a matter of time before it sank to the bottom. Exactly 6 weeks after I walked out of that glass building for the last time, the ticking time bomb finally detonated. The disaster did not begin in a corporate boardroom. It began in a suburban emergency room in Ohio. A young patient was rushed through the hospital doors completely unresponsive, his breathing dangerously shallow and his pulse fading rapidly. The emergency medical staff frantically pumped his stomach and pushed massive doses of reversal agents into his veins, fighting for hours to stabilize his vitals. When the toxicologist finally pulled the blood work and traced the empty pill bottles found in the patient's bedroom, they uncovered a horrifying reality. The patient had suffered a massive, near-fatal overdose from extremely high-dose sedatives. Those pills had not been obtained on the street. They had been authorized over the internet, without a single physical examination or a thorough medical history review. The prescribing physician listed on the pharmacy label was Dr. Vance. The platform facilitating the transaction was VitaStream Health. The federal government does not send polite emails when a digital platform starts operating as an illegal pill mill. They send armed agents. 48 hours after the overdose was reported to the authorities, a fleet of unmarked black sport utility vehicles abruptly surrounded the VitaStream corporate headquarters. Agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, working in strict coordination with the State Medical Commission, did not bother waiting in the lobby. They swarmed the open-concept office floor in tactical gear, flashing federal badges and barking loud commands to step away from all keyboards. The vibrant, chaotic startup environment, once filled with the arrogant sounds of ping-pong tournaments and boastful tech jargon, was instantly paralyzed. The agents aggressively unplugged the mainframes, seized every single server rack, and physically locked the entire executive team out of their own proprietary platform, with a few decisive keystrokes. The federal authorities enacted a complete, nationwide freeze on the prescribing system. No doctors could log in. No patients could be seen. The cash flow was instantly severed. News of the massive federal raid leaked to the financial press long before the stock market opened the following morning. The public fallout was absolute and merciless. VitaStream watched its multi-million-dollar valuation vaporize into thin air in a matter of hours. Major venture capital investors, terrified of the catastrophic legal exposure, desperately scrambled to distance themselves. They pulled their remaining funding, issued frantic public relations statements denouncing the company, and abandoned the leadership team to drown. Inside the building, the atmosphere shifted from aggressive arrogance to pure, unadulterated panic. The very same executives who had recently laughed off regulatory fines as a simple cost of doing business were now staring directly down the barrel of severe criminal indictments. Facing the terrifying, very real prospect of federal prison time, Chloe and the chief executive officer barricaded themselves inside the corner office for a closed-door strategy session. Their survival instincts violently kicked in. erasing whatever tiny fragments of morality they had left. They needed a sacrificial lamb to offer the federal prosecutors, and they needed one immediately. Together, they formulated what they genuinely believed was an absolutely flawless, airtight defense strategy. They decided to pin the entire catastrophic failure directly on me. They drafted a narrative portraying their former compliance specialist as wildly negligent. They planned to tell the federal investigators that I had completely stopped doing my job during my final month. They would claim that I had grown bitter and lazy, maliciously allowing a dangerous, unverified doctor to slip through the cracks before abruptly abandoning my position, feeling a sickening surge of misplaced confidence. Chloe and the panicked legal team gleefully spent the entire night drafting a comprehensive, entirely fabricated incident report. They were completely convinced that I was a helpless, easy target. After all, I had been gone for nearly 2 months. I had surrendered my company laptop, my physical security badge, and all of my administrative network credentials. In their desperately arrogant minds, I had absolutely no access to the internal network to defend myself or contradict their carefully crafted lies. They thought they were playing a brilliant, ruthless game of chess against an opponent who had long since left the board. "She is gone, and she cannot prove otherwise," Chloe reportedly told the chief executive officer, a smug smile returning to her face as she signed the falsified document. "We hand them the compliance officer's file, and we walk away clean." But their smug satisfaction violently disintegrated the exact moment the federal authorities demanded the digital evidence to support their fabricated timeline. The lead investigator ordered the engineering team to extract the raw, unfiltered cloud server logs detailing the exact minute Dr. Vance was approved and who had authorized it. When the frantic engineers desperately tried to pull the historical data from the highly touted cloud storage architecture, they discovered a catastrophic, irreversible technical disaster. The heavily promoted auto-approve feature, the very same software update Chloe had recklessly rushed to deploy to boost her precious growth metrics, contained a massive fatal coding error. In its blind haste to process thousands of applications simultaneously without any manual oversight, the automated system had overloaded to keep the servers from crashing. The poorly written code had continuously and aggressively overwritten its own cloud storage archives to save memory. Every single digital log from that crucial operational period had been completely corrupted, scrambled, and permanently wiped out. The multi-million-dollar servers held absolutely nothing but digital static. The entire executive board collectively stopped breathing when the lead engineer delivered the news. The digital system was utterly destroyed by their own blind obsession with speed. There were no digital logs to manipulate. There were no server backups to forge. The only surviving, legally verifiable records of what actually happened on the day Dr. Vance was hired were the physical, printed documents sitting in the master compliance binders. The exact binders I had meticulously curated and deliberately left sitting right in the middle of my perfectly clean desk. The atmosphere inside the main conference room at VitaStream headquarters was thick enough to choke on. It was no longer a space for ping pong and trendy beverages. It had been transformed into a makeshift federal interrogation chamber. Sitting around the massive oak table were the remaining board members, a small army of terrified corporate defense attorneys, and the lead investigating agent from the Drug Enforcement Administration. At the far end of the table, Chloe was delivering the performance of a lifetime. She was dressed down in a plain, somber blouse, her usual aggressive arrogance replaced by a carefully constructed mask of shock and sorrow. She actually managed to squeeze out a few genuine tears as she wove a complex, highly emotional tale of my supposed betrayal. She passionately testified to the room that she had trusted her compliance officer completely, claiming she was utterly devastated to discover that I had maliciously neglected my duties, allowed a dangerous doctor onto the platform out of sheer laziness, and then cowardly fled the company to avoid accountability. The federal agent sat quietly across from her, his face completely unreadable. He let her talk. He let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. He watched her dab her eyes with a tissue, listened to her eloquent, practiced lies, and waited until she had firmly committed her entirely fabricated version of events to the official federal record. When Chloe finally finished her monologue, taking a deep, dramatic breath, the room fell silent, save for the nervous shuffling of legal pads. "Are you absolutely certain about this sequence of events, ma'am?" the agent asked, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "I am positive," Chloe answered, her voice trembling with perfectly faked conviction. "She bypassed our protocols and left us completely exposed. We are victims of her gross negligence." The agent did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached down into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavily sealed manila envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the oak table with a loud, resounding smack that made the chief executive officer physically jump in his seat. "That is incredibly fascinating," the agent said, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table, "because roughly 3 weeks before we even knew Dr. Vance existed, a private defense attorney walked into our regional field office. He handed us a highly secured, military-grade encrypted hard drive, along with a perfectly organized physical binder, strictly to protect his client under federal whistleblower statutes. That client was Paisley Diaz." Chloe stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. The corporate attorneys lunged forward, frantically tearing open the envelope to examine the contents. The knot Chloe had so carefully tied violently unraveled right before her eyes. The printed documents spread across the table were undeniable, irrefutable proof of her guilt. There, in crystal clear, time-stamped black and white ink, were the raw system logs that their faulty servers had managed to destroy. The pages highlighted my exact keystrokes rejecting Dr. Vance. They displayed the urgent, explicit emails I had sent warning the entire executive suite about his revoked medical license. And, most damning of all, the logs showed the exact minute, down to the final second, that Chloe had utilized her master administrative credentials to manually override my safety lock and forcefully activate his account. The lead corporate attorney slowly pushed the documents away, rubbing his temples in absolute despair. He knew it was over. The agent looked directly at Chloe, whose hands were now shaking uncontrollably. "You are not looking at a corporate fine for a software glitch today," he stated coldly. "You are looking at a personal, direct penalty of $250,000 for the intentional tampering and falsification of federal medical credentials. That penalty belongs entirely to you, along with the wire fraud and federal narcotics distribution charges we are currently preparing. VitaStream is facing permanent dissolution, but you are facing federal prison." Chloe completely collapsed into her chair, her tearful victim routine shattering into a million pieces of genuine, paralyzing terror. There was no growth metric or auto-approve function that could save her now. A few days later, my personal cell phone began to ring incessantly. The caller identification displayed the frantic numbers of the VitaStream Human Resources Department and their desperate legal counsel. I let the phone vibrate silently on my desk. I sat back in my luxurious, incredibly comfortable leather chair inside my massive corner office at the new hospital. The morning sun streamed through the large windows as I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of a perfectly brewed espresso. I casually reached over and pressed the red decline button on my phone, sending their panic straight to voicemail. Mounted on the wall across from my desk, the flat-screen television was tuned to the morning financial news network. The breaking news ticker at the bottom of the screen was flashing bright red, displaying live helicopter footage of federal agents carrying cardboard boxes full of hard drives out of the VitaStream corporate headquarters. I smiled softly, watching the house of cards finally collapse into dust. I had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the most devastating, perfect form of corporate revenge does not require screaming, fighting, or throwing a tantrum. It only requires a quiet exit and a perfectly preserved paper trail. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's corporate revenge story satisfying, Please help us keep the channel alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, because YouTube has demonetized our channel. We rely entirely on your support to continue producing these high-quality narratives. On our Patreon, you will unlock access to our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that are simply too intense and detailed to post publicly. These premium episodes feature incredible multicast emotional voice acting and extended runtimes. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description and pinned comment. Thank you for standing with us, and I will see you in the next story.